My name's Alex. I'm 32, an architect, which means my days are usually spent wrestling with blueprints, making sure gravity plays nice with concrete and steel. I deal in absolutes, in measurable spaces and predictable loads. But nothing, absolutely nothing in my entire career prepared me for the kind of amorphous, chilling reality I stumbled into a few years back. It's a reality that still gnaws at the edges of my sanity, a persistent whisper that mocks the logic I've built my life upon. The year was 2021, and the world was tentatively trying to find its footing again after what felt like an eternity of lockdowns and uncertainty. For me, however, a different kind of lockdown, a psychological one, was about to begin. I'd just wrapped up a monumental project, a new civic center that had consumed every waking hour for the better part of 2 years. My brain was fried, my nerves frayed. Friends were excitedly planning trips to Santorini, hiking the Inca Trail, or just rediscovering the joy of crowded city life. Me, all I craved was silence, a complete, utter disappearance from the demands of civilization. That's when the cabin in the Appalachian foothills, inherited from my grandfather, resurfaced in my mind. He'd passed away when I was a kid, and the cabin had sat untouched, a relic from a simpler time. It was the kind of place where cell service died miles before you even saw the driveway, and the old landline probably hadn't rung since dial-up modems were cutting edge. It was perfect, or so the exhaustion-addled part of my brain decided. The drive was a journey back in time. The slick, multi-lane highways gradually dissolved into cracked asphalt county roads, then dwindled further into a narrow, winding gravel path. The trees, ancient sentinels reaching for the sky, began to close in, forming a dense canopy that barely allowed slivers of sunlight to pierce through. The air grew progressively colder, thick with the earthy perfume of damp leaves and ancient pine. It felt primeval, untouched. I remember the odd sense of peace that settled over me, a feeling of shedding the artificial layers of city life with every mile marker I passed. This was it, true escape. The cabin itself was a photograph from my childhood memory. Weathered planks, a porch sagging just a little in the middle, and a sturdy stone chimney that promised warmth. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect. 2 modest bedrooms, a small, functional kitchen, and a living room dominated by that magnificent stone fireplace. Dust motes danced like tiny galaxies in the sparse beams of light filtering through the grimy windows. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged wood, damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic and forgotten. I spent the first full day in a frenzy of activity, a therapeutic purge. I swept away decades of dust, scrubbed down surfaces, threw open windows to banish the musty air. The physical labor was cathartic, a simple, tangible way to assert control in a life that had felt increasingly out of my hands. That evening, I sat before a roaring fire, mesmerized by the dancing flames, the only source of light. The absolute silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of burning logs and the gentle whisper of wind through the surrounding trees. For the first time in what felt like forever, I truly felt at peace. The next few days were a blur of uncomplicated joys. I retraced the old hiking trails my grandfather had shown me, paths that were now overgrown but still vaguely discernible. I tried my hand at fishing in the nearby creek, though my patience rarely yielded much beyond a few nibbles. I devoured old, forgotten paperbacks I found tucked away in a dusty built-in bookshelf, thrillers and forgotten classics with yellowed pages. Meals were simple affairs, cooked over the fire: canned beans, instant noodles, grilled sausages. And the sleep was divine. Deep, dreamless, the kind of restorative slumber where your brain finally, truly shuts down. The only sounds were the predictable chorus of crickets at dusk, the mournful hoot of an owl, or the gentle rustle of leaves as a deer passed by. It was the perfect antidote to the urban cacophony I'd left behind.
Then, the almost imperceptible shift began. It started so subtly, I almost dismissed it as my overactive imagination, or maybe just the eccentricity of an old, isolated cabin. The first instance was a small, perfectly carved wooden bird. I found it resting on the porch railing one morning, perched there as if it had always belonged. It was intricate, a testament to incredible skill. Every feather, every tiny detail meticulously rendered. I knew, with absolute certainty, it hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. I picked it up, marveling at the smoothness of the wood, the delicate balance of the piece. A hiker's lost trinket? A local artist's offering? I shrugged, a small smile playing on my lips. It was a charming oddity, a welcome break from the monotony of the forest. I brought it inside and placed it on the mantelpiece, a small, benign mystery. The next day, a smooth gray stone, shaped almost perfectly like a teardrop, was sitting on my kitchen counter. Not on the porch, not on a shelf, but right there, next to the small bag of coffee I'd brought. My blood ran cold. I hadn't put it there. I was alone. I hadn't had any visitors. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. Did I somehow absent-mindedly place it there myself? Did a squirrel somehow manage to carry it in and deposit it? The ideas felt ludicrous even as I thought them. I walked through every room, a growing unease coiling in my stomach. I checked the windows, the heavy wooden front door, the back door that led to a small overgrown yard. Every single entry point was still locked, just as I'd left them. My initial peaceful bubble began to deflate, replaced by a prickle of unease, a sense of something off. That night, the real unsettling began. I woke abruptly, not to a loud noise, but to a soft, persistent tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from inside the cabin, unmistakably. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the absolute silence. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source in the oppressive darkness. The fire had long since dwindled to embers, leaving the cabin steeped in an inky blackness that seemed to press in from all sides. I fumbled frantically for my phone, its flashlight beam cutting a harsh, stark path through the dark. The tapping stopped, just as suddenly as it had begun. I swept the beam across the living room, across the cold stone of the fireplace, over the worn armchair, the dusty bookshelf. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing moved. My gaze lingered on the mantelpiece. The small, intricately carved wooden bird was gone. A deep, bone-chilling dread seeped into me, colder than the mountain air outside. This wasn't a lost trinket. This wasn't a wandering animal. This was something else entirely. I spent the rest of that night wide awake, huddled beneath the thin blanket, my eyes darting nervously around the room, seeing shapes in the shadows, hearing whispers in the creaks and groans of the old cabin. Every rustle outside sounded like hesitant footsteps, every branch scraping against the roof like a fingernail dragging across wood. The profound peace I had sought had curdled into a chilling sense of vulnerability. By the time the first faint rays of dawn pierced through the trees, painting the window a dull gray, exhaustion warred with a gnawing, irrational fear. I tried to rationalize it away, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a reaction to the isolation, to being overtired. But deep down, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow, that this was not my imagination. Something was in the cabin with me, or, at the very least, something was watching me. And it was just beginning to make itself known, a subtle, insidious creeping that promised to unravel everything I thought I knew about being alone in the wilderness.
The first full day after the incident with the bird and the stone was a blur of hyper-awareness. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, every shadow seemed magnified, imbued with a sinister intent. I kept telling myself it was stress, that the isolation was getting to me. My logical, architect brain craved an explanation, something I could draw, measure, understand. but the only explanation my gut offered was a cold, primal fear. I spent the morning meticulously rechecking every lock, every window latch. I even boarded up the small, unused window in the back bedroom with some spare planks I found in the shed, telling myself it was for insulation, not because I felt like I was being watched. I paced the small living room, my gaze constantly sweeping the mantelpiece where the wooden bird had been. It was just gone, no trace, as if it had never existed, save for the chilling memory. Lunch was a tense affair. I forced down a can of soup, my eyes darting to the kitchen counter where the teardrop stone had appeared. It wasn't there now. Another disappearance. It felt like a deliberate game, a slow, methodical unraveling of my composure. I considered packing up, just leaving. But something stubborn, something almost defiant held me back. I'd come here for peace, for escape. I wasn't going to be scared away by a few odd occurrences. Not yet, anyway. That afternoon, I tried to focus on a book, but the words swam before my eyes. My ears were constantly straining, listening for anything out of the ordinary. The silence, which had once been a balm, was now a heavy, oppressive presence, pregnant with unspoken threats. Around dusk, as the cabin began to fill with long, creeping shadows, I decided to go for a walk. I told myself it was to clear my head, to get some fresh air. Deep down, I think I just couldn't stand being cooped up inside anymore. The woods, which had felt welcoming just days before, now seemed menacing. The ancient trees loomed, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the fading light. Every snapped twig, every distant rustle sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I heard something, saw something, just at the periphery of my vision. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know someone is staring at you, even when you can't see them. The air grew colder, and a thin mist began to weave through the trees, clinging to the branches like ghostly shrouds. I decided to head back, my unease escalating with every step. As I neared the cabin, a strange light flickered in the distance, deeper in the woods, off the main trail. It was a soft, pulsating glow, like an old dying firefly, but larger and strangely persistent. Curiosity, mixed with a chilling dread, pulled me towards it. I moved slowly, silently, weaving through the underbrush, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The light led me to a small clearing I'd never seen before, despite my grandfather's extensive knowledge of these woods. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient, gnarled oak tree, its trunk impossibly wide, its branches twisting into grotesque shapes. And at its base, nestled amongst its sprawling roots, was the source of the light. It wasn't a fire. It was a cluster of stones, smooth and dark, arranged in a rough circle. And at the center of the circle, emitting that soft, ethereal glow, was a single larger stone. It was the exact same shape and gray color as the teardrop stone that had appeared on my kitchen counter. Only this one was emitting a faint, pulsating light. And etched onto its surface, barely visible in the dimming light, was a symbol. It looked like a series of interlocking spirals, intricate and ancient, unlike anything I'd ever seen. My blood ran cold. This wasn't natural. This wasn't some random occurrence. My logical brain screamed for me to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted to the damp earth. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated from the stone, a low vibration that seemed to travel directly into my bones, making the hair on my arms stand on end. The air around the clearing felt impossibly heavy, charged with an unspoken energy. I felt like I had stumbled into a place where the veil between worlds was impossibly thin. As I stood there, mesmerized by the glowing stone, a sound broke the profound silence of the woods. It wasn't a human sound, not an animal cry. It was a low, mournful sigh, like the wind itself was weeping, coming from somewhere deep within the ancient oak tree. It was accompanied by a subtle shift in the air, a drop in temperature that felt unnatural, biting. The light from the stone intensified slightly, pulsing brighter, illuminating the clearing in an unsettling, otherworldly glow. Then, the branches of the ancient oak began to sway, slowly at first, then with increasing violence, even though there was no wind. The leaves rustled like dry parchment, and a faint, sweet smell, like damp earth mixed with something cloyingly floral, filled the air. My breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My mind raced, grappling with the impossible. From behind the gnarled trunk of the oak, a shadow detached itself. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to ripple at the edges, absorbing the already fading light. It wasn't a person, it wasn't an animal. It was a presence, a living absence. It glided rather than walked towards the glowing stone, its form indistinct, almost translucent. I couldn't make out any features, just a taller, darker void against the darkness of the trees. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be a hallucination, a trick of the light, the product of my increasingly frayed nerves. When I opened them again, slowly, hesitantly, the shadow was closer to the stone, its indistinct form seeming to coalesce, to gain a kind of ephemeral substance. And then, from within its swirling depths, I heard it. A whisper, not a voice, but a collection of sounds. Rustling leaves, distant water, a sound like dry bones rubbing together, all coalescing into something that resonated directly in my mind. It wasn't words, not in any language I knew, but a feeling, a pervasive, ancient melancholy mixed with an undeniable hunger. Terror finally unglued my feet from the ground. I turned and ran, blindly crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the scratches from the branches or the stones that bruised my feet. I didn't look back. I just ran. The image of the pulsating stone and the shifting shadow burned into my mind, the chilling whisper still echoing in the hollow space behind my eyes. I ran until my lungs burned, until I burst out of the tree line and stumbled onto the path leading to the cabin, gasping for air, my entire body trembling uncontrollably. I slammed the cabin door shut behind me, fumbling with the lock, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the bolt. I leaned against the door, panting, eyes wide, staring into the darkness of the living room, convinced that the shadow was just outside, pressing against the wood, waiting. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap. The peace I had so desperately sought had been shattered, replaced by a profound, suffocating terror. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that whatever had been merely watching me before, whatever had been playing its subtle, insidious games, was now fully aware of my presence, and it was no longer content to simply observe. I don't know how long I stood there, pressed against the door, my breath ragged and shallow. Minutes bled into what felt like hours. Every creak of the old wood, every distant hoot of an owl made me flinch. The silence inside the cabin, once so comforting, was now a roaring void, filled with the echo of that whispered ancient hunger. My architect's mind, which thrived on structure and logic, was in freefall. I was trying to piece together something, anything that made sense of what I'd seen, but all the pieces were from a puzzle I didn't recognize. A glowing stone, a swirling shadow that wasn't quite a shadow, a whisper that resonated in my very bones.
Eventually, the sheer terror gave way to a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't going to just sit there and wait. I stumbled into the kitchen, my hand still shaking as I grabbed the largest hunting knife I'd brought. It felt ridiculously small and useless, but it was something. I carried it with me as I moved through the cabin, turning on every light switch, even though the dim, flickering bulbs only seemed to deepen the shadows. I pulled all the curtains tight, as if a thin sheet of fabric could hold back whatever was out there. The night stretched on, an agonizing eternity. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the gnarled oak, the pulsating stone, the rippling void of that entity. I sat in the living room, knife clutched tight, staring at the front door, then at the windows, then at the empty mantelpiece where the wooden bird had been. My mind cycled through frantic questions. What was it? What did it want? Was it tied to the cabin? To my grandfather? When the first weak light of dawn finally seeped through the cracks in the curtains, painting the cabin in a dull, sickly gray, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. I hadn't just been awake, I'd been on edge, every nerve screaming for hours. But the terror hadn't entirely dissipated. It had simply receded, like a tide pulling back, leaving behind a chilling residue. I knew I couldn't stay. The cabin, my sanctuary, had become a cage. I had to leave. But something in me, some morbid curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for answers, pulled me back towards that clearing. I told myself it was to retrieve my sanity, to prove to myself that it had all been a trick of the mind, a nightmarish hallucination. With the sun barely kissing the treetops, I ventured back into the woods. Every step was deliberate, every rustle of leaves sending a jolt of anxiety through me. The forest still felt menacing, but the daylight provided a thin veneer of courage. I found the path I had blindly crashed through last night, the broken branches and disturbed earth marking my frantic escape. As I approached the clearing, my heart began to pound anew. I pushed through the last line of thick bushes and stopped dead. The clearing was empty, completely, utterly empty. The ancient oak tree stood there, its gnarled branches reaching to the sky, looking exactly as it had before. But the circle of dark stones was gone. The larger, glowing teardrop stone was gone. There was no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. The ground where the stones had been was covered in a fresh layer of damp leaves, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. It was pristine, untouched. My mind reeled. Had I dreamt it? Was the exhaustion finally making me lose my grip on reality? I frantically searched the area, pushing aside leaves, digging at the damp soil with my bare hands, desperate for any shred of evidence. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was as if the clearing had simply reset itself. I stood there for a long time, the cold morning air seeping into my bones, even colder than the previous night. The absence of evidence was almost more terrifying than the encounter itself. It meant whatever had happened, whatever I had seen, existed outside of what I understand as reality. It could appear, disappear, leaving no trace, making me question my own sanity.
As I turned to leave, a glint of something caught my eye at the base of the ancient oak. Partially buried in the loose soil, almost entirely covered by a thick moss, was something small and dark. I knelt down, digging with trembling fingers. It was the little wooden bird, the one I had found on the porch, the one that had vanished from the mantelpiece. Its intricate details were still there, but now a faint, almost imperceptible symbol was etched onto its chest. A tiny, interlocking spiral, identical to the one I'd seen on the glowing stone. I picked it up. It felt heavy in my hand, impossibly so for its size. A tremor ran through me. It wasn't a hallucination. It had been real, all of it. The subtle game, the terrifying presence, the impossible disappearances. And now, the wooden bird was back. A dark souvenir from a place that shouldn't exist, bearing a symbol that belonged to something ancient and malevolent. I didn't try to rationalize it this time. I didn't try to find a logical explanation. I just walked back to the cabin, the wooden bird clutched tightly in my hand, its weight a constant, chilling reminder. I packed my car in a silent frenzy, throwing everything in haphazardly. I didn't even bother to clean up, to lock the cabin. I just got in the car, started the engine, and drove. I drove faster than I ever had, down the gravel path, onto the county roads, never once looking in the rearview mirror. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cabin, between myself and whatever inhabited those woods. I never went back to the cabin. I couldn't. Every time I think about it, a cold dread washes over me. I still have the wooden bird. It sits in a locked box deep in the back of my closet, a tangible link to something I can't explain, something that defied all logic and reason. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I think I can still hear that soft, mournful sigh, that impossible whisper from the ancient woods. And I wonder, sometimes, if the forest let me go, or if it just decided it was done with me for now. I wonder if the stories my grandfather told about things that sleep in the deep woods were more than just campfire tales. I live my life. I work, I build, I draw my lines. But sometimes, especially when the light fades and the shadows lengthen, I feel it, that lingering presence. It's like a quiet, patient hunger, waiting. And I know with chilling certainty that the woods are always there. And sometimes they call.